Okay, welcome everyone to September's Augmented Society Network. Jim, thank you all for coming. We've got just under an hour. Topic for discussion, actually, Mitchell, was generated from something that you said last time. Yeah, so be careful. We were discussing the future of the workforce. We were talking about immigration. We were talking about having access to the right skills, knowing what the right skills are that we need, and perhaps veering on to the need just to be able to learn and not be quite so embedded in what it was that we were learning, but just to have the ability to learn. And you said there is no need for us to be able to know everything and have answers to a huge issue or a problem. We can't offer the be-all, end-all solution, and we should stop trying to do so. However, there has been a long period of time when that kind of approach has been what's been required. On a project I worked on in London, it was a huge project that ran over a number of years, and we needed to raise a lot of money. And without knowing roughly what it was that we were proposing, it was very hard to go to investors and say, we just need some money, actually. We've got a lot of R&D to do, yet we can't tell you exactly where it will go. However, now, and for some time, it's actually been imperative that you've been able to have that R&D money without the ability to say where it is that you're actually going. And to be on top of transformation, Daryl, we were just talking about that. Knowing how to see disruption is an entirely new skill that I'm not entirely sure I've got, but I have got some experience of delivering in an agile fashion, and I've got experience in delivering in a more waterfall, if you're interested in the project terminology. If we base that also on the fact that nobody knows what's in the future, how on earth are we expected to do the work that we're all engaged in? I'm interested in your experiences in that, and I'm hoping that you actually were able to watch the video of the fable of the sparrows and what Tim Bostrom was illustrating in regard to not knowing what the future holds and the establishment of a superintelligence. This is where the theme, along with what Mitchell was talking about, began for our discussion today. So I'd like to open with a question to everyone. What's been your experience of delivering something that you perhaps didn't understand yourselves, and how did you bring others along with you to enable you to get to work on something?
I can address that. I do that every day at my job, because essentially the Air Force identifies what they call gaps or problems that they have that they don't know how to solve. They bring them here to our center, and then I basically develop a path to a solution to that. It's in so many different areas. I mean, everything from food safety technology to AI to building aircraft parts to alternative power sources. So I'm certainly not an expert in any of those things. So every time I'm facing a new challenge, I have to think about, okay, how do we solve this and what resources are needed to do that? And so we have basically a standard approach, which is first we start out by focusing on what the problem is as opposed to the solution. And we look at who the key stakeholders are involved in that process. That's anybody from the customers or the users to people who have to make decisions about it, to people who have to support it, or, it can be quite extensive. But once we have an understanding who those key stakeholders are, we bring them in and we say, what do you really think is the problem here? And we have them define the problem, and we build consensus around that problem. And one of the ironic things is that, when I go out with my family for dinner, I don't know how it is for you guys, but we have a hard time agreeing on where we're going to go. And there's just 4 of us, right? So trying to get a whole room full of people who may disagree right from the beginning anyways, and trying to get them to do that, that's what we do. And we're pretty successful at that. And once we have that consensus, then it's very easy to then say, okay, now that we know the problem, now that we have consensus behind it, people are invested in solving this problem, it's easy to say, hey, we need this kind of a resource, that kind of resource, because now we've just magnified our networks by all the key stakeholders that are involved and their networks and organizations.
So just a question for you, Daryl. Do you ever bring up OODA loops? Or do you know what they are? Because
Yeah.
because that comes out of the Air Force.
Yeah.
So that's why it's so cool. It's a whole process for iterating and not knowing exactly where you're going, but being able to rapidly adapt based on competition and the environment.
Yeah. So we don't.
What do you call them, Mitchell? Sorry.
OODA loops, OODA.
Yeah, I am familiar with them. We don't formally use them, but we are very iterative because once we've defined the problem, the next step that we do then is we then explore solutions. And we're not set on any particular solution, but we're exploring a lot of different solutions. And then the next step there is defining a path to that solution.
Right.
And then once we have that, we begin to iterate, we begin to attempt to validate and test. So that's where probably the OODA loop would come in at that point, but it's not a formally recognized part of the process.
Because if you're working with the Air Force and you're not going to, and obviously these are complex problems, so you're not going to have solutions ready-made like right from there. It might help for you to start just using the term OODA loops to say, we have to, let's approach this so that we can, rapidly adjust and rapidly react to feedback and use the term.
Can you take us a little bit into that, Mitchell? I don't know what they are.
So the person who founded it is a person named John Boyd, JOHN BOYD. He was an Air Force fighter pilot. And what he determined was that the most successful fighter pilots, him included because he was never shot down, were the ones who were able to come up with new tactics quicker than other people and react to to any changes that the other people are able to do. So if you think about it, as you're flying a jet, as you're in a dogfight, you're observing, you're trying to figure out what the other person can do and what your options are. You decide to do something and then you do it, and then you quickly observe. So that's kind of a loop. If your loop is faster than the other person's loop, then they're going to get confused because you're doing new actions before they finish analyzing what they want to do next, and they're confused, and then you're going to be winning. Then he started applying that to not just Air Force, to dogfights, but to tactics, strategies, and building organizations. So, so the two most common errors are to observe and then act without so you're not really thinking and trying to figure out what to do. So that's error number one. And the second most common error is to spend too much time analyzing, because then you're not acting. But the most key step, that's not phrased right, but the key step, the critical step, is that second step, which is orient. And that's where you're using the information from that you've gotten before, any new feedback that you've gotten, any resources, and any possible actions that you've already come up with. So the ability of having a number of possible things that you could already do and deploy is very important. And the more strategies you have that come from the wider variety of fields, the better you are to come up with new things to do.
So we utilize design thinking, human-centered design, and it's almost like how rock music has its basis in blues. I think it kind of goes back to the kind of tools that you're describing. A lot of these tools are borrowed and kind of incorporated into those processes. So while we don't use a formal OODA loop, we're still using that same process.
Yep. Well, so lean practices, agile practices are both slightly different variations on it. I just found, it's hard to find information on OODA loops because he never wrote anything. All he did was lead workshops and I'm going to date myself because you all probably haven't heard this term before. He used foils.
Foils.
So foils.
Okay.
Okay, so foils are acetate slides that you use on an overhead projector.
Okay.
Okay, so people have these foils that he used as he was leading these lectures, but that's the only written materials that he's left. A couple people have written books about it. They're very arcane books, so I've actually used. I teach a 2-day workshop for young adults called sense making, and this process of rapid iteration and making sense of the environment really quickly is the third part of that workshop.
So I've just lent someone Malcolm Gladwell's Blink book, a fantastic book concerning your ability to stay alive, which clearly, Mitchell, you were referring to flying a fighter jet.
Right.
An agile container in its own right. Now, if you put that into the Navy, Daryl, they have warships, they have static buildings, they have jets. All of these things require a way of thinking to deliver solutions. There is a full gamut of project methodologies that you can deploy. And now I can deploy OODA loops too.
Right.
Although I've only just learned that.
Yeah. So
I
was going to say something that one of the things that really came out of him is when you design a fighter jet, you may think, or designers thought that having the fastest jet or the jet that's capable of doing the tightest loops and turns is the key thing. But the key thing in a fighter jet is to be able to change what you're doing rapidly. So if you're banking right, to quickly change to bank left, that's more important than being able to turn right or left better. And so his jets they weren't as fast, and they didn't have as tight turns as the Soviet MiGs, but they were more capable in dogfights because the pilots could change their tactics quicker than the MiG pilots could.
So that's an interesting point that you're bringing up, Mitchell, because what we're really talking about here is to determine the specs or the needs of whatever the solution is that you're developing. And, I think about tankers, like the KC-135s or things like that. Mm-hmm. They're not very maneuverable, especially compared to a fighter jet, but for their purpose, right. The specs that they're there to accomplish their mission, we'll say, they're very well suited for that. So the question really becomes the question of specialization versus kind of a general application of things. Sometimes you want things to be more general and appeal to a number of different missions. Other times has to be one specific mission. And it actually ties back to the workforce issue as well.
You also have to end up with a jet though, don't you? You also have to end up with seats that fit, with oxygen that fits into the space that's there for it. So there is a huge sense of order in that process to face an issue, a circumstance which is utterly unknown, in which if you behave erratically, you have an advantage.
Which,
don't tell my kids that.
Yeah. Well, the thing is say what you want about him, but that's one of the strengths of Trump, is that he can change direction much quicker than his opponents can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd also like to reference back, which I find myself in the world of Albert Weiner more days of the week than perhaps Trump. Albert Weiner was involved in the understanding of trajectories and the understanding of mapping things that you can actually determine just using math. I'm still fascinated about how you get a something out of a nothing, and that process there. Now with the Navy, Daryl, you've got huge budgets that are agreed in advance. and then you have, I guess, your R&D budgets, and you have areas of innovation, you have areas of consolidation. How does that apply to us? How do we live in that world?
Well, I think that whatever it is that you're trying to figure out, whatever it is, no matter, I say that all ideas are developed the same way, using the same process. Even if you come up with something very simple, I mean, even at home, if you're trying to get your family to buy into something, you have to have their consensus and buy-in if you want them to participate. I mean, you could force your kids maybe to do
mine
things.
just get told.
Yes. Yeah. But for most people, you do. And the thing is, even if you can tell somebody to do something and they're simply complying, you'll never get as good of work as you would if they're voluntarily and they're actually invested in it. And I have found that, we get a lot of pushback here because quite often when we're brought problems, we say, hey, let's start out by identifying what the problem is here and building this consensus around it. They say, no, we already know what the problem is. We want to move forward with the solution. And people in general are very quick to want to move forward with the solution without understanding the problem. And what I've discovered in doing a lot of this kind of work is just that the problem is very rarely identified properly.
Yeah.
And because people don't understand cause and effect. And the other thing is that when it is understood, in the few cases it is, you still have to build that consensus around it. And when you involve people in the process of saying, hey, what's the problem? What do you think the problem is here? Let's hear your side of it and gain empathy for it. Now you've entered a whole different, you've just increased successfully, the probability of successfully achieving what you're trying to do.
Sure, but your management has to be behind that. I've had issues where the senior management say, yeah, we're behind that. We want you to introduce person-centered design, let's say. And then as soon as you do, it's like, no. We knew what we wanted, actually. What do you mean you're asking the people who will actually use it? Where does the data analysis, the needs analysis actually come into this when our brand says we are doing this? And how do I articulate to senior management a solution that is data driven, that actually also fits the brand? What happens if you find out that the company is now doing something utterly different? What do you do then?
So
just don't go in the next day.
It's very rare, I think, that management really has an understanding of what could be innovative, or else, I mean, innovation really is kind of unexpected for the most part. And so it's not like they wake up and they say, hey, we know what we need. So often I see where management they either are not bought in or they don't have awareness of what they're doing. But, the thing about innovation is that it's all about people. We tend to focus on the tech side of it. The tech is just a result of good innovation when it's working. But the fact of the matter is that innovation begins and ends with human beings. And so we have to understand those human psychological and emotional drivers that tend to drive how we make decisions. So management, they're just managing the risk and looking at something. And if they're brought something, like you had mentioned, Zoe, about the data and driving it with data, and that is great because that helps them to gain a better understanding, helps them to mitigate the risk, or at least get a feeling that they can mitigate it. But I think it's just like any kind of a relationship, is that there has to be trust there. And so when we deal with issues where management is not open to innovation or they're not accepting it, is we say, start smaller. Start with small projects that you can readily do with the resources you have available. Start to acquire victories, start to develop trust, and then you slowly build up so that management now feels that, hey, you have the ability to handle the greater risk that we're exposing here in trying to pursue this innovation.
Yeah, where that goes completely outside of what I perceive to be project management. But I've realized over the last 20 years, it's the only thing that actually gets me anywhere. I just find I feel quite uncomfortable. I'd much rather be, stuck 10 years ago, ensconced in waterfall with the pot of money and the accountant, and they're just getting on with it. I find it all quite upsetting to be so far out there and so prone myself to the data when it shows me things I don't really, I don't know how to do, or I didn't want to do.
So I think one of the things, we all think that we know what we don't know. So I don't know how to do this. You're a consultant. Tell me how to do this. And that's relatively easy to do. If I'm right that in order to achieve my goal, I just have to fill in what I know that I don't know. It's kind of a linear process. The thing that always hurts us most as companies or as individuals is what we don't know that we don't know.
Yeah.
And it's only by going through the processes that you were talking about, or the building of consensus and bringing in more people, that and stepping back and say, something, if you want to achieve this, and here's what we're all thinking that you don't know in order to achieve this. But maybe, what do you think about taking a step back and figuring out what we don't know that we don't know, things that might really hurt us and prevent us from getting where we want to do?
So a friend of mine back in the UK has adopted slow living.
Uh-huh.
And I'm fascinated by what she's doing and how impossible I feel that.
I'm not sure I understand the term.
So actually it's stepping back from Daryl being, looking down the site or from what you were saying, Mitchell, about being able to respond quickly. I think I'm addicted to speed and change and doing something. What slow living does is say, okay, so you can see something, just leave it alone, let it develop, let it come to you. Slow it down to the point where it either, and this is my interpretation, it's probably not correct, but it may not be anything you actually need to concern yourself with if you leave it to develop. Sustainability is built into it as well, but it's much more about taking time and care over things.
Okay.
I just checked it out on Wikipedia. S is for sustainable, L is for local, O is for organic, and W is for whole. So
the whole thing has to work out.
Yeah.
Which is not the world I live in.
Oh, you like processed food and...
No, sorry, Wayne, I'm not referring to it in terms of food. I've actually just lifted it up and seen how it applies. How do I just switch off occasionally and consider the whole?
I got you. So you're talking not about the food slow, but just the lifestyle of slow.
Yes.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I can definitely see where, that would come in handy in a lot of cases because, in this day and age that we live in, I'm on lots of threads and listservs and stuff like that, and people are just like blowing up left and right, and they're just typing things like just as they think of them, and then they hit the send button, and it's like, really, people, just take a minute.
Yeah. Well, what I think is really cool about that approach is, I've come in my experience, and perhaps you guys would have different opinions on this. My perception is that the greatest enemy of innovation and moving forward is bias. We have a bias that it can't be done. We have a bias that has to be done in a certain way. We have a bias of a particular solution in mind before we actually understand the problem. So when you talk about letting things develop organically, I think that's very important because that implies that you've eliminated the bias, or you've taken steps to eliminate bias out of the system. And that's when real success comes. When what I bring, what value that I bring, and it sounds like Mitchell brings as well as a facilitator, is that we're not biased. And in fact, my lack of knowledge about the topics and just the deep knowledge about the process of innovation is really wonderful because I don't have a bias because I don't have any understanding of the field that I'm trying to develop things in. And that's been very helpful because the people that we bring in have the expertise and they have the opinions and they have the biases. And it's my job just to help them to kind of put those biases aside and let's tap directly into that knowledge and expertise. So that's very appealing. And I think the ultimate, it's almost like it's a theory of communism. Communism is kind of a beautiful thing. It's everybody working together and sharing of the what's produced from the work, but it never works like that in real life, unfortunately. But I think that's an ideal to hold and to shoot for.
And as you bring up biases, and one of the other things that hits me is that most of us, maybe probably all of us, just to a large extent, aren't even aware of our own biases. It's not like I say, well, I am biased about this. It's more like I grew up as a white male, okay? And so there are certain things that I don't even know about because my environment was a certain environment.
Mitchell, that's a great point. And that's one of the big problems in programming AI, because you might have people from a specific demographic doing the programming, and then that bias gets baked into the AI.
Which is kind of why, Apple facial recognition recognized Caucasians much better than it recognized people of color, right?
So what if we just said, actually, I don't care about bias. I just think we should aim for the superintelligence, and I'm going to go to a country where I'm allowed to do whatever I like, actually. And I'm not going to be concerned about legislation, policy, whatever. Where does that take us? Is that something we should be absolutely petrified about, or does that enable us to change in the rapid sense that we think can sometimes be good?
It's important to make a distinction between bias and morality, because they're two very different things. And I think you can, as long as you have humans involved, you're always going to have the problem of bias creeping in. And it's like tending a garden. You have to constantly address it as it comes up. But the morality is a totally different issue. Based on the question, I think it's important to maintain morality. In fact, I think it's probably even more important now than it's ever been. But the question is, what is that morality? And of course, to each country or each nationality, it may be very different.
So how many concerns are involved in your iterative process? If we go from one end, which is the OODA loop, through to perhaps a slower, agile, if I've got the meaning right, how many elements of concern, morality go into each loop? How big does that have to go?
So I'm just going to go to the OODA loop, because there's an aspect of it that when you're involved and you have to do things and you want to be able to react fast, but before you start, there's a tremendous amount of preparation. So you still want to be prepared. That's what in order to be a great fighter pilot, the pilot had to go through years of training.
Yeah,
and that kind of draws back to culture, because, for example, if you take, say, the Air Force, there is a very distinct warrior culture that is developed within the Air Force, and every organization has its own culture, and it's during the defining of that culture and the building of that culture is where questions such as morality or ethics or any of or even biases that are developed come out.
So I thought I was a warrior, doing the job I was doing in a non-profit, getting great decision making out for people who were in pain, and creating a virtual assistant that understood that. And I had no idea when we started how much preparation that was going to take. And in fact, it became entirely preparation to the point of, crikey, are we ever going to get this out? What we actually got out was something that required a huge amount of understanding in terms of what it can do. So this can do this and this only, but it can do it very well. So you can fool a chatbot very quickly if it's trained in a narrow domain. So we would do all of the work. We'd spend months and months and months, and then someone would come along and say, what's the weather today? And it would say, well, I'm sorry, I'm not aware of that. And we learned that actually we had to put an awful lot of effort into the context around the purpose. And understanding that context meant we needed to understand the people it was designed for. But it was very easy to break what we'd made, even with months and months, if not years of preparation. And that became an incredibly difficult thing to protect, if you like, when it came to raising money or an agreement in terms of we need another 6 months. It was, I felt warrior-like in terms, and I'm not sure that that's quite what you meant, Daryl, but where does the warrior in you come out when you know you're up against it with something that actually other people, including funders, are starting to lose patience with?
There's a lot that can be said about communicating your vision. I mean, when we think about prototypes or MVPs, really what the point of them is to communicate what the vision is, of at least the basic function of that vision, to somebody else who may not be able to understand it. And so I think when you look at people like investors or other stakeholders or management that have direct control over the longevity of your project, and you're fighting every day to get that going, I think it's a matter of saying, how do I communicate it in a way that they're going to understand? And more so, I always talk about risk, because innovation is so risk driven, is to show them how do we mitigate that risk and what are the benefits, and then acquire those small victories. But the thing about what you were working on, and you brought up a very interesting point, Zoe, was you were talking about breaking it. And really, I mean, I think the whole point of innovation is to become so innovative within a culture or within an organization that your greatest competitor is internal. It's yourself. So shouldn't we always try and strive to break what we build so that we can then say, hey, how do we then improve it and make it so that it's not so breakable, at least by our competition, whoever that may be?
Sure. So the idea of family here in terms of companies is much stronger, I think, than it is in the UK. You're part of a family. People wear the T-shirt to work. There's a range of tops that you can buy into. You can go in with your IBM top on, with intelligence is where it's at and everything else. The idea of the warrior within a family creates an environment that is safe to do that in. But I have been astounded by the lack of family when it comes to actually, I've been with people recently who've gone into work and come out in the next half an hour without a job. How does that equate, being that warrior, going all the way out there, living the family, and then actually that string, that rope breaking? I find it fascinating here in the US, more so that I think than in the UK. Don't know if there's a question in there or not, but that idea of being protected, going all the way out on a limb, risk registers completed, obviously.
I have a cynical view that organizations want people to work hard because they feel that they're protected, but that the organizations also don't want people to really be protected, because they want the ability to throw them out when they're no longer needed. And so there was, in the 1950s, when you had a job, you had the job for lifetime. The organizations want you to feel, something, I want to put all my effort into this company because they're going to protect me, but the organizations aren't fulfilling their part of that bargain. They're not protecting you. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a big source of the dissatisfaction that's happening in the US, is that people have been operating based on a set of rules that the companies or the people in power weren't operating under.
But at the same time, it feels to me like at this point, your only way forward is to be that warrior. If the organization is going to face or be the face of disruption, then it needs people who are willing to go out on a limb. So how do big corporations, maybe even government or entities deal with people who have to be out there? How do we innovate and yet try and get some of the protection, or how are big companies responding to that?
So I think that one of the I'm going back to OODA loops again, because one of the things that Boyd talked about a lot was that you have to, as an organization, you have to value the information more than the results of the information. So if somebody comes to you and says, I was responsible for this task and it didn't work, having that information is incredibly valuable. But if you value the results of the information, which is the person had a task to do and they didn't do it, and so that person then becomes punished, then you've devalued the information. And an organization at the top has to be very clear: are we going to value the results of the information and punish people who don't do well and reward people who do well? Or are we going to value the information so that people can feel safe imparting the information, which we really need to move forward?
I've seen people like leave the safe zone generally for two reasons. One is either that they're not performing in whatever their task is, and the other one is that they're trying to implement some kind of change, which may not be welcome, whether it's innovation or whatever you would like to call it. But I've had to learn a very hard lesson myself personally over and over again, and it made me look at things a little differently, which was that we all, when it comes to the change aspect, I think it's natural for most people to look at something and say, hey, I think we can do this better. I have to do it every day. It would make it easier for me. I'm willing to try to do that. And of course, they usually will try, and they're the nail sticking up, and then they get hammered down. They say, you know what, where's the benefit in doing it? I'm not
right.
And we've probably all been victims of that at some point. But what I've come to learn
That's why I don't have any hair.
Maybe it'll come back. Who knows?
Okay.
Stay positive. But the thing is, what I have observed is I've come to look at it in the way that you have innovation or change over here, and you have production over here. So let's say you have a company, whatever they're making, we'll just say widgets. It can be a product, service, process, whatever. They're producing some kind of widgets. Their goal there is to minimize risk and to make things more and more efficient. So when somebody pops up over here and they say, hey, I have an idea for something that could potentially introduce risk into the system, the systems will say, no, I'm designed to take risk out of the equation and to maintain production. Over here on innovation, you have more risk it's more risk tolerant, and it's more friendly to risk at times, and it gives you that process to explore. And what I found is that the best situation occurs when somebody is able to do innovation outside of the production cycle, at least to a point where they can validate it, they can test it, and they can demonstrate that, hey, this can be scaled up. And then at that point, then they work together to reintroduce it into production. So an example I like to use is assembly line. You would never, if you thought, I have an idea for something, you'd probably never test it out directly on the assembly line. You build a smaller assembly line model on the side and try it there and see before you would introduce it in. So many times in innovation, we're our own worst enemies, because here we are trying to bring about change, but we introduce it into the production side of things, and then we wonder why we get beaten down for it. Well, at least that's how it seems to me.
Yeah. Although for some, that is actually a way of doing it, isn't it? Is creating huge disruption and then seeing what falls.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you can do that if you're new into an industry, but when you're generally a part of an organization that is responsible for production, they're not always so friendly towards that. Even at Google or someplace that we think of as being very innovative, they still have to deliver products and services.
Yeah. So in the unfinished fable of the sparrows, which I'm going to assume you all watched.
I don't know that I got it. So.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, you're forgiven then.
If I did, then I shouldn't be forgiven. But I don't remember seeing it.
It's actually immaterial. But there are two main characters in that essentially. The idea is that a new idea comes to the sparrows about finding a baby owl that they can grow that will then do all of their work for them. So the owl will fend off birds, it will look after their young, and some of them go out looking for an owl's egg, and then they are bringing it back, and the owl turns into a monster. There are two characters in there. There's Straufunkel, who can see this coming, and is the doomsayer of, do you not think we should do the preparation? Do you not think we should prepare? And on the other side, you have Pastus, the leader, who goes out and says, no, this is amazing, let's go and do it. This is what we have to do to survive. The birds next door have created a pavilion of, what's it called, unlimited grain. So they're watching these birds who just can eat and eat and eat and eat. Obviously that hasn't been fully thought through yet either. But my question is, who are you? Are you always Straufunkel planning? Are you Pastus saying, let's go and do it? How do you, because I feel like I'm both. On some days I'm this, on some days I'm that, but on most days I have to be Straufunkel. I have to be planning. But I don't know when I'm losing track on when I should become one or the other, particularly with the need for innovation. So as a professional, where are you? Who are you? What's your story within that one? Mitchell.
So I'll say I'm whatever the other people are, I'm the other one.
Oh, okay.
You're a contrarian.
I'm a contrarian. I'm always raising the other side.
So that's Straufunkel then. You're definitely a Straufunkel.
Okay. Well, but if it had been that everybody was inclined to do the other one, then I would be arguing for the owl. It's like, well, wait a minute, you're dismissing it too quickly. I'm looking for generally the solution that meets all the different, that meets a variety of different criteria, whereas I find that most people are looking at very narrow criteria as they're coming up with solutions.
I understand. Yeah, I got that wrong. Wayne, who are you?
Well, when it comes to technology, I love technology. And I used to be the kind of person that was like, yeah, let's do this and do that and just embrace technology. But now in this day and age, I'm actually pulling back more and kind of looking at the old school way of doing things.
Bringing back some of the quality to the analog.
Yeah, just digital. Like the internet, for example. We have these internet ghettos now, like Facebook and Twitter, and it's all about being locked into their environment, and you can only say what they want you to say, and you can only see what they want you to see. And in the past, when the internet was first created, it was we could all participate. We could all create a web page, and you could come see my web page and I could go see your web page. And it turned into this ghettoization of these isolated communities. So I just recently deleted my Facebook, deleted my social media. I'm still on Meetup because it's a good way to meet, local people. I don't really like Meetup, but I'm still there. So yeah, I'm kind of going old school, even to the point now where pretty much exclusively running Linux and GNU Linux because it is free 100%, and in the terms of freedom, not cost. So yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm going old school because it just feels a lot better than being controlled by my software.
Sure. I was absolutely fascinated by the purchase of Red Hat by IBM. I was thinking, wow, that's interesting. Daryl.
Yeah. I'm the guy, I guess I'd be the bird in this case, that would bring those two different birds together in the same room and say, we need each of your opinions here, and let's bring them together, and let's see how we can move forward, but at the same time addressing your concerns over here about why you think this is going to be a problem.
Okay, so a tightrope basically of both.
Yeah, and I like what Mitchell was saying earlier about being the contrarian, because I think you need, when you're in a place where everybody has the same view, that's a problem. It's got to be challenged. Somebody's got to be there to say, hey, I don't think this is going to work. Well, why don't you think it's going to work? Let's explore that. Let's think up every possible problem that we can have with it and try to address it. So
that's, again, Wayne, what you were saying about actually having a space where everyone's comfortable to say what they really think.
Yeah, or just, have the ability, like, for instance, I was in this one meetup group, and they said, hey, come to our Facebook page if you want to get involved with the discussion. And for the first time since I deleted my Facebook, I was like, well, I can't participate in that, because unless you have a Facebook account, then you can't go to that group. You can't look at that page,
Sure. Yeah.
And I said, well, it'd be nice if you publish something on your website where I could look at it, because I don't choose to use Facebook.
Yeah, and I think that's only going to grow actually as we fragment. From order comes chaos. That's just a matter of time passing. I think I would love
it takes people speaking up too.
Yeah.
Because if everybody's there, then everybody's there,
So that leads me nicely on, actually. I think we'll finish up today, but our next session next month is actually about the fragmentation of communication, actually. Russia and China actually practicing cutting off the cable to other countries, the defragmentation of some of the things that I've actually taken for granted, but have obviously evolved into something that perhaps, well, I certainly didn't see, and on some instances don't appreciate. So I hope you can join us for that. Thank you very much for,
Thank you.
I really enjoyed the conversation today. That was absolutely fantastic. So I will sign off and say, I hope you can join us in October, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks for putting this together.
Bye. Nice to meet you, everybody.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.